Bye.
Okay.
Hello.
Hello, everybody, and welcome. We'll just wait another minute or so, and then we'll get things started. Okay, in lieu of time, we'll get things started, and I'd like to welcome all of you today. My name is Melissa Whaling, and I am the Executive Director of Pegasus Institute. And this is one of our many webinars and roundtables within our virtual event series. And we offer webinars and roundtables in 3 different languages, so in English, French, and Spanish. And we hope to grow this over time and include other languages as well. In terms of Pegasus Institute, for those of you who don't know, our mission is to promote equity, justice, and global health in its nexus with peace and environmental sustainability. And we do that through interactive fora, sharing research, education, field experiences, advocacy, and policy. Next slide, please. So today's panel is on youth and sustainable food systems in Africa. It's going to be a really interesting and engaging panel with 4 experts who I'll introduce in just a minute. Next slide, please. So we'd like to officially welcome you all again. And I'd like to present a small land acknowledgement. So while we are gathering virtually today, we acknowledge that each of us is on the traditional territory of many nations across this land. I am broadcasting from central Newfoundland, the traditional territory of the Beothuk, Inuit, Innu, and the Mi'kmaq peoples. Today, it is home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We offer this acknowledgement as a stepping stone towards honoring the original occupants, a testimony to the oppression faced by Indigenous peoples, and our commitment to creating dialogues aimed at addressing such systematic injustice. Next slide, please. So I'd just like to introduce our wonderful panel here today, who will be engaging you in conversation and presenting some of their work. We have Chimwemwe Salihara, who is an independent governance and development practitioner. He is a Malawian based in The Hague, Netherlands. He is program advisor for sustainable development at ODPRAT, which is a mission in Africa, OIA, the Netherlands. He has co-authored a book chapter entitled Africa's Vulnerable Children and the Millennium Development Goals, Experiences and Interventions in Malawi, in Geographies of Global Health Issues, Change and Threat, 2016. Apart from that, he is a seasonal contributor of opinion articles in Malawi premier newspapers, especially on global development issues. Next, we have Mary Cesar. Her primary research areas are governance, public health, food security and food systems, gender and race in South and Southern Africa. She has a law degree from the University of Cape Town, South Africa, and a PhD from Queen's University, Kingston, Ontario. Prior to her doctoral studies, she worked in the nonprofit sector in South and Sub-Saharan Africa. She completed a postdoctoral fellowship at the Basili School of International Affairs, working with the Hungry Cities Partnership, an international research and public policy project working in several African countries, the Caribbean, and Asia. She has extensive research, teaching, graduate supervision, and project management experience. Next, we have Dr. Liam Riley, who is an adjunct research faculty member at the Basili School of International Affairs, Wilfrid Laurier University. He holds a PhD and an MA in geography from the University of Western Ontario and a BA from McGill University. Dr. Riley's work highlights the intersection of gender, food, and urbanization in sub-Saharan Africa. This area of research draws together broad questions about social equity and inclusion, environmental and demographic change, and the politics of development in African cities that sheds light on critical policy issues. Much of his work has focused on Malawi, where he has been working since 2007. And last but not least, we have Sierra Versillo, who is a postdoctoral fellow and an adjunct professor at the School of Environment, Enterprise and Development at the University of Waterloo in Ontario, Canada. Her research interests are broadly located in the fields of feminist geography, political ecology, and critical development studies, with a focus on agrarian and nutrition transitions, smallholder rural livelihoods, urban food systems, and household food security in sub-Saharan Africa, particularly northern Ghana. Sierra has also been working in agricultural extension and cooperative development across West Africa for the past decade. Thank you all, and I'd like to start the webinar with Mary. Welcome.
Thank you.
We can see your slides now, Mary. All good.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Missy. Thank you so much for this invitation, and to Pegasus for organizing this event. Missy, if there's a problem with my volume, can you just let me know? So basically, I'm going to ask a few questions in this presentation based on the work that I've done so far. I looked primarily at the governance and food policy literature, and I'm working on different forms of governance. So I wanted to focus on some of the questions that came out of that research in this presentation. This is very basic, but I thought I'd sort of make sure we are all on the same page in the event that there are people here who may not work on food governance or public policy. So just basically designing and implementing food policy. When I talk about designing and implementing food policy, I place it in the larger context of food system governance, that food policy is but one, whether it's a document, it's but one document in a set of documents. It's generally, hopefully, food policy is the outcome of a consultative process. And it should also be considered as part of public policy. And I have a very short definition: anything that government chooses to do or not to do. And I guess the not to do is also an important component, and I have a comment about that later on. Participating in designing or implementing food policy rests on a few assumptions. There's an expectation that the participants will have a certain amount of expertise, whether it's knowledge about a specific aspect of the food system. It could be experience It could also just be education. I think it's also important to know that participation in these forums or processes participation is not equal. Not all actors have equal participation. Not all actors have equal power, whether it's political power or socioeconomic power. So based on those sort of general comments, what I want to engage in, or what I would like us to think about, is that the extent and the nature of youth engagement in food policy making or in the food system raises important questions, and it's an important aspect to consider. And I discussed this obviously only for South Africa. So the question that informs this presentation is whether there's any value in the application of an intergenerational approach to food system governance, specifically food policy, that can ensure youth engagement. And as I mentioned, I will focus on South Africa. I'm going to first try and locate the youth and youth organizations in the South African food system and in the food policy landscape. And then I do an overview of the food policy actors, again, with a view of locating the youth or youth organizations. And then I will end with suggesting applying an intergenerational approach to food policy making and implementation. This is just a cautionary note that this is part of a larger research project I'm working on. So a review of the National Food and Nutrition Security Plan for South Africa. This is the current food policy. There are 3 places in the policy where youth is mentioned. In the analysis section of the policy, there's a comment that youth, 2/3 of South African youth are urbanized. So I guess the importance of that acknowledgement by the drafters is that when we look at food policy and youth, we need to consider the fact that the majority of those identified as youth live in cities. Youth is also mentioned in the strategic objective 2 of the policy. Strategic objective 2, as listed here, is to establish an inclusive local food value chain to support access to nutritious and affordable food. This strategic objective, there are a number of activities or actions listed in the food policy in order to achieve this objective. The main intervention is employment in the local agricultural value chain. So I guess it's across the agricultural sector. And so the way in which the food policy indicates how to measure this, this intervention is increased employment and participation in local agriculture, in the local agricultural value chain. It will be measured by the number of youth participants. In 2016, the baseline measurement, just over 13,000 youth participated in the local agricultural value chain. The target for 2020 was to raise this to 30%, so that 30% of smallholder producers are supported are youth. And by 2023, the government aims to support 50% of youth smallholder producers who identify as youth. So just in summary then, in terms of the policy, youth is mentioned as well in terms of employment in the agricultural sector. Youth is also mentioned in Strategic Objective 5, and this is to influence people across the life cycle to make informed food and nutrition decisions. The main strategic action here is a communication strategy. And for that communication strategy to focus on the entire life cycle. However, to prioritize early children under 5, school-going children, youth and adolescents. So again, youth is prioritized as a category in Strategic Objective 5. The interventions listed is to make sure that youth and adolescents are included in nutrition education on healthy food choices and food diversity, in youth-friendly services, and in I guess this is a BeWise MobiSite app. It's a communication app social media app in South Africa. Promotion of nutrition related messages, and also to determine the number of facilities targeting youth that are promoting nutrition related messages. It's sort of very complicated, I feel, but the baseline in 2016, according to the research, there were no nutrition related messages targeting youth specifically, either in government facilities or on the social media app. The target for 2020, according to the 2020, according to the policy, the target for 2020 was to be 25% facilities, and in 2023, 35% facilities. There isn't one definition for facilities targeting youth in the policy, but it's just a range of facilities that provide services to youth. So in terms of the actual food policy document, there's a recognition that youth is urbanized. Youth there should be a support for youth in the agricultural sector, and nutrition related messages targeted at youth. In terms of the governance actors in the policy making arena, I put this up. I know it's difficult to, it might be difficult to read, but it's an illustration of all the actors who are involved in food policy making at the moment. The top left, purple, is where the National Youth Development Agency is listed. And the National Youth Development Agency is a government organized agency, and the objective of this agency is to make sure that youth issues and job creation for youth are mainstreamed. So working with other government departments, other government agencies to ensure that youth is included in their program of action, and working with other government departments when they in terms of their youth creation, job creation programs. So in my assessment of the policy, I focused on the food policy only. Of course, there are many other policies that focuses on food related issues. I focused on the food policy primarily because this is the key document dealing with how food will be, food production, food distribution, processing. It deals with issues of consumption. It identifies priority groups. And in my assessment of the policy, the youth voice the youth voice seems to be absent as policy actors. The youth voice seem to be absent from the policymaking process. I also found that in terms of the youth as a group, a beneficiary group, they are one of many groups. And in a sense, it made me think about if we want to, how would we go about if we wanted to incorporate youth and the youth voice in food policy making in a more systemic way. And so I'm asking whether an intergenerational approach perhaps is one way of doing that. I'm relying on the notion of the intergenerational contract and perhaps an operationalization of this contract. And what does that mean? It brings a rational understanding of generations to food systems governance with an emphasis on sustainability, with youth and or the future as the foundation. An intergenerational process perhaps can also help to advocate for a generational understanding regarding the actors in the food system and in food system governance. Recognizing youth as one social group with rights and agency, not only in relation to other generations, but as people who are interested in a secure future. So what would this mean in practice, and how could it apply to food governance? One example would be youth participation, making space for youth at the table where the food policy is being discussed or being designed. It could also mean youth advocacy, and this is action by youth organizations themselves or by young people. And youth advocacy could be demanding, quote unquote, demanding space at the table. Alternatively, demanding that a youth perspective informs the food policy. And this is related to the third point I want to make in terms of the application of an intergenerational approach, is to make sure that there is an generational lens applied to food policy making. So if the youth voice is not present at the table, perhaps those who are at the table should ensure that youth experience of the food system, youth expectations of a food system, that those things are incorporated in the food policy. Some thoughts about why an intergenerational approach should be considered. And this is where I connect the food policy with public policy in general. We know, for example, that public policy provides structure, for example, zoning regulations. It provides guidance for public spending. And also it allows policymakers to choose what to prioritize and what not to act on. So for example, it can be a policy choice to not criminalize informal food traders. It can also be a policy choice to invest in infrastructure to support informal food traders. Public policy, in a sense, and therefore the food policy, imposes some form of equity, one would expect. And so an intergenerational approach can perhaps ensure youth participation or the application of a generational lens, in a sense that food policy decisions made today will have a long-term impact, and to keep in mind that future impact. So yes, it can be considered as sustainable food systems or sustainable food system governance. I'm part of my thinking is whether a specific, whether the intergenerational approach will perhaps force policymakers to think about the future impacts of policy decisions made today. Are there any downsides perhaps to this approach? These are preliminary thoughts, because in some ways it brings us back to the definition of youth. Maybe some of the other speakers will address this issue, but we do know that youth as a group is not homogeneous. Their engagement with the food system is dependent on many factors, including gender, race, education, wealth, geographic location. And I guess another factor to consider is the intergenerational relationships in certain cultural contexts, which may well influence the power or lack thereof that youth may have. So I'm going to end there for now, and look forward to engaging with my fellow panelists and people in the audience on some of these questions.
Thank you very much, Mary. And we'll move on to see what Chimwemwe has to say. Welcome. Mary, you just have to hit yeah, stop sharing. Perfect. Thank you. Chimwemwe, are you okay to share your screen, or would you like Camille to put up your slides? You're on mute, sorry.
Hello.
Hello, now we can hear you.
Maybe she can help me to put it.
Sure. Camille, would you be able to put up Chimweme's slides, please?
Yeah. Thank you very much. Can you hear me there? All right. Yeah. Thank you very much for giving me an opportunity to present some of the things which I'm engaged with, especially with OPLAC in Africa, which is implementing in southern part of Africa. So this is a case study specifically in Malawi, which is also in southern part of the country. So it's one of the project in Chikowa district, which looks at the empowering the vulnerable group through sustainable rural livelihood. Yeah, down. Yeah, so the presentation outline, first of all, I'll come with a brief country background info, some of the data, the organization, which is OPLAC in Africa, and some of its partners, project approach, and project objective, then results and lesson learned from the project. Yeah, so I think some people may be familiar already, but just for the sake of presentation, Malawi itself is one of the countries, as you can see in the map, where we are located. And it's ranked 174 out of 189 countries in the world based on the Human Development Index, which is based on 2020. And Malawi itself, the government of Malawi, it has come with a broad print document, which does outline all the development which the country should undertake in order to graduate from least developed countries to middle income country. So the document is Malawi Vision 2063. Apart from that, also we've come up with a document which will be which have put all the indicators and the measures, which is the 20 years interval, so that within 10 years, then they'll be coming to evaluate again if Malawi is on track or not. So in terms of statistic, Malawi population close to 52% were estimated to be poor, and out of a population of 17 million estimate, close to like I can say like most of the population that are the youth of the country. So it's like the country itself in terms of demographically, they are the youth. Thank you. Another one. Yeah, so organization which I'll mention based on what the project which I will try to explain. It's a Dutch organization, a Dutch international Christian organization, which was founded in 1976 by colleagues here in the Netherlands, which aim is to work in solidarity with their friends in the southern part of Africa. So countries which they work is Malawi itself, Mozambique, Botswana, South Africa, and Swaziland. Now Swaziland has changed, it's another name. Yeah, so the emphasis of this presentation, I'll be focusing more in Malawi. So other things I'll just see, I'll not mention much about which side of Botswana and South Africa and Swaziland. Area of interest is empowering orphans and vulnerable children through sustainable rural livelihood projects. So sometimes they call it OVCs. As you can know that the country, since I think from 1980s, and especially 83, 84, 1990s, we have been an issue of HIV and AIDS, which was really an issue in Malawi. With that, it happened that most of the orphan and vulnerable children were at focal point so that they should be empowered, despite that they are finding some other difficulties to live and to sustain their rural livelihoods. So in order to do that, the organization has come with also, it works in economic empowerment, irrigation, food security, and climate change intervention, and also God pass on. Other programs also, it works on child-centered projects like daycare and also humanitarian activities, especially during disasters. So why I'm saying this, because like most cases, it's like it's a historical, our approach is more holistic, whereby we're not only focusing on a child, but we're putting different aspects. If it's health, also we're looking at food security, also looking at education. So it's like we're putting one thing at one basket. Different things in one basket. So the work is being done through partners. Most of them were churches in Africa, the southern part of Africa. And in Malawi, we're working with the Evangelical Lutheran Church. And it's based in Choro district, but now it has got different branches in the southern part of in Malawi. Thank you. Yeah, so in terms of the approach, you can see the picture. The picture is one of a scheme in Chikwawa district, which is the Kazomba small scale, which is 7.5 hectares. So the approach is that through cooperation with partners, for this project to come, it was through community-driven ideas for the project to create, for project designing. Apart from that, also learning and innovation through most significant change, which is one of the unique things which institution here in the Netherlands, OPLAC in Africa, is trying to share some knowledge to the to our partners in Malawi, whereby the local communities are given some skills so that they can monitor and also write some success stories of the projects. So this is one of the monitoring approach, which is most significant change. Apart from that, the project is works with the existing structure already in the district. For example, area development committee, which is overseer of all development activities once it has been passed at the district executive committee, which they approve the project to be implemented in the district. Apart from that, we also work in departments in line with the projects. For example, this project, although level, we're working with agriculture, irrigation, social welfare, and disaster education. Why? Because in terms of agriculture, they give also some technical know-how to the youth and also to the vulnerable group, and also some new method of irrigation. Because our focus is orphans and vulnerable children, that's why we work together to identify most of the vulnerable group through social welfare. So in terms of, because of now Malawi, it is prone to disaster of climate change and other side effects. That's why we also embark in disasters, especially so that the people, in order to save life, sometimes also for them they can be recover, then mitigation. Apart from that, also we give out education so that the people should take over the project on their own when the project phase on. Thank you. Yeah, the project objective is to empower the offices through sustainable projects at community level. As I earlier mentioned, that is through our partner there in Malawi who come up with some structures, so that those structures, they should liaise with the area development committee and also other committees which they exist in the area of where the project is being implemented. So it's like also a provision of skills of project management, because it has been a tradition in most cases whereby most project always is always us outsiders who know more. And when we phase out the project, we may see that the project at the end of the day is nothing, it's just history. But now the approach, we say like at the end of the day, this project should be more sustainable. People should be given, those the vulnerable group should be given the skills of project management. For example, in this project of food security, we're looking at how we can sustain in terms of, for example, how to make seed application seed on their own, like sweet potato, maize, also like maybe how they can find the market. So all those things to bring some different skills so that you can and integrate it in the project management of a project of this project. Also, we supporting youth information of economic empowerment groups in small scale schemes. This is more in Africa, especially in Malawi. There is a project we call voluntary saving and loans, but also we've also incorporated self-help groups. These are economic formation whereby people stay in groups, they meet maybe per week 2 times, and they share some ideas how they can save. So it's more like a voluntary scheme whereby those guardians and other people, they save in kind. When the amount has reached a certain amount, then they share to each other. Yeah. Apart from that, we also do. Apart from that, we're also looking at improve food security at household level and community level, so that each household they can be able to have food, and with that they'll be able to voice out at community level. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, results. The project targets 1,500 vulnerable households, which mostly, if you may check some of the pictures which I've attached, most of them are not like people who are maybe 40 or 50. They are 20s, in their 20s and 30s. Because like in Malawi, the definition of the youth who have adopted the one which is being defined by African Union, which is from 15 up to 35. Yeah, so apart from that, there is us vulnerable, most of the vulnerable youth were able to engage in economic activities in the district. Apart from that, the social capital has been enhanced, and they're able now within the group, in their committee, they're able to be given some leadership, maybe to present the traditional authority in that area at the district level, at the government officials. So they're able to create some issues, especially when there's maybe other organization coming with something relating to food security, on food production. They're able to send these youth from the project. Yeah, another. Yeah, lesson learned from project. I believe that involving all stakeholders in all stages of a project cycle of a project is paramount, is great, and is also encouraged, whereby people, they know which stage now have missed, so that they can correct it. And knowledge transfer, as I mentioned earlier on, that some of the things like most significant change as part of monitoring and evaluation techniques is able to make some transformation in the area. The provision of capacity development to a vulnerable community is important, especially committees and guardians. All these things, we're doing that, and they're able also to share when other organizations that want to implement a similar project. They're the one giving out some lesson how can they also transform in the community. I believe that the youth could be a drive for development, especially in food security project, because in these schemes, the chairperson is someone who is at the age of 29. And now there's also inclusion of different genders. You can see in the picture, there are also some women harvesting some maize in the scheme. Yep. And on. Yeah. So here is just a picture of a scheme. The scheme is it is being used with solar irrigation, because in Malawi, especially in part of Chikwawa, the rain is it's unpredictable. Some most cases it's erratic, or sometimes it's prolonged dry spell. So to be at a safer side, we've promoted this one, which is also the government of Malawi. They're also in line promote renewable source of irrigation, so that when the rain is not there, they'll be able to sustain at community level and also at national level. So here they are sharing some notes, and also this is some like a canal where they share they share some water, like to go this side, this side. Apart from that, inside, if you could check, the other what is maize, the other one is sweet potato. So it's not only one thing, because we're looking at, because they should also help orphan and vulnerable children in the area. Most of them are manualist, so that they should improve their cognitive development. Thank you. Yeah, so this is just part of a success story of a project, which was last year. It was reported in national newspaper about irrigation, how irrigation can be sustained. So that so it is online. You can check it later on. The heading was irrigation for sustainable development, whereby it was being outlined some of the lessons, how other organizations, how the community, people in that area can also learn and also share some lesson learned and some success stories to other members. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you. That's all. So I hope there's also some questions which are shared.
Thank you so much, Chimwemwe. So I think we'll continue and hold the questions to the end, but if you don't want to forget your question and you have a burning one, feel free to put it in the chat and we will get to it after Liam and Sierra speak. Next up is Liam Riley and then Sierra. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's see, am I on? Okay. Sorry, I'm trying to get to there we go. Okay, great. Thank you so much, Mary and Chimwemwe. It's yeah, I'm really happy to get all these different perspectives on this big question. We're going to continue to be in Malawi for the next couple of minutes. Just a little bit of background in terms of where my research is coming from. I was first in Malawi in 2007, which is actually when I met Chimwemwe. And then in 2010, I did my fieldwork in Blantyre, looking at urban household food security. And, you know, we found there was a regional project called the African Food Security Urban Network that did surveys in low-income neighborhoods across the region and found that in Malawi, there were actually higher levels of food security among low-income households than in other cities in the region. So we were trying to observe through qualitative methodologies what that would look like and figuring out how people access food. And there were just a whole range of different ways that people were able to access food through farming in rural areas and within the city, and you know, different types of community support systems. And so this current project that I'm going to discuss today, we conducted in 2019, and some of my references to change will come from my own observations over that time. And I think that there's been a huge shift in the cities and how they're organized in the built environment. So anyway, some of the key questions. I need to get rid of this little thing here. So this, I'm going to have a lot of photos in my presentation because the research project that we did engaged young people living in informal settlements to go around the city and take pictures and videos and things. I'll discuss the methodology more in a moment. But one guy in Blantyre, he lives in a very densely built informal settlement called Chilomone, but he can walk from there about 20 minutes, half an hour to this place where people have farms, people are growing food, and he told the story about how it's part of his food environment. He remembers coming here with his friends to collect tree sap, and then they would make some kind of concoction that they would use to trap birds, and then they would play and snack on the birds. And anyway, so he has all these emotions associated with that as well, in terms of the happy memories, but also thinking about his friend who passed away. So this is just a glimpse into what, you know, an urban environment in Malawi can look like, and that doesn't necessarily conform to a lot of our preconceptions about what cities look like. You know, and you can choose to take any kind of framing of a place in order to describe it. So what we're really aiming to do is give the more control to the young people to create that framing process and tell their own stories. And through that, learning about the food system, learning about urban informality, particularly in Malawi, understanding their perspectives, and then using that, like I think Mary also talked about this focus on the future and where are we going, and using a youth focus to try to understand what those trends could be and what the possibilities are. And I'll discuss the idea of foodscapes in a moment, but it's a concept that's really had been mostly applied in the global north in different contexts, but I thought there was a lot of opportunity to learn about developing societies as well. So I'm just trying to be mindful of time. Chimamanda gave a great summary of the development challenges in Malawi. It is mainly rural still, so the types of communities where Chimamanda is working, that is more typical. It's only 16% urban, but the population overall is growing so rapidly that even though the share of the population who's urban is fairly static, the cities themselves are still growing very rapidly. And beyond that, there's also a systemic issue that can't be overlooked in terms of how the urban and the rural communities interact, how people move between the two, how people rely on markets and economic productivity in the urban context, even within the context of their own rural livelihoods. So the food system really needs to be understood in an integrated way between the rural and the urban areas. Briefly, the three main cities that we looked at are Lilongwe, which is the capital, and in terms of its built environment, it's relatively new from the 1970s. It's about 1 million people now. Blantyre is the older city. It's in the southern region. Began in the 19th century. It's about 800,000 people. And Mzuzu is the administrative center for the north. Anyway, this is the Mzuzu. It's the fastest growing city out of the three, but it's still the smallest of the three, and it's also fairly new. And then briefly to just touch on this idea of foodscapes and why I'm using it. You know, within the urban context, one of the challenges that we try to address is that the food exists. So often in Malawi, when people start talking about food security, it immediately goes to production, and specifically maize production and maize storage and that sort of, which is also very important. But theoretically, what we find in the cities is that the food is often there, it's available, but it's not accessible. It's not safe. Maybe it's not the best food in terms of micronutrients and that sort of thing. So there's all these other barriers to food security that we find in African cities. And Foodscapes helps us to kind of go beyond that by bringing in cultural, geographical issues, identities, lifestyles, anyway, all kinds of other issues. It also highlights ecological sustainability and food justice. And one of the papers that I relied on a lot when setting this up was by Mywald and McCann, who note that Foodscapes offers a language for thinking through food-place relations in terms of geographies and politics of urban poverty and survival. So it brings in that geographical focus, that tangible, everyday life kind of perspective to the discussion. Here's another photo, just incidentally. I thought it was interesting. It's a schoolyard, and you can see on the periphery these food vendors providing food to the students. So the methodology that we used is really key to what we've achieved. It was focused on this concept of repositioning the relationship. So the researchers, our research team, including Dr. Chilanga, who's also on the call today, we were more like facilitators. So we approached community-based organizations in informal settlements in each of the cities to help us coordinate with their youth groups. And we had 6 young people in each city participate, but they were really given the tools to become the researchers. So we were working with this concept of like a subject researcher in a way. So rather than interviewing people or surveying people, we were giving them the technological tools to go out and create and document their own foodscapes. So they were given tablets. Each tablet had a survey programmed on it that could collect a GPS point, and then also other multimedia information related to that place that then could be mapped afterwards. So they could take videos, they could take photos. Today I'm mostly focusing on the photos, but the URL here under materials has all of the videos uploaded. It's very much raw data at this point, but we wanted to have that accessible in order as part of this broader concern with giving voice to the young people. And there were also discussions. So the discussions are where a lot of the stories come from and a lot of the concepts kind of come together. We had a full day of focus group discussions after in each of the cities, discussing it, introducing concepts like food sovereignty and gender equality and urban futures, urban development, that sort of thing. So for the remainder of the presentation, I just had these slides with photographs and stories behind the photographs. Here are chiwaya, these kinds of outdoor fry stands that you probably see in cities all across sub-Saharan Africa. Were very significant within the foodscapes that the youth documented. So these are places where they can access cheap, tasty food. Often you can, it's a place where you can afford to buy meat and consume meat. It also had significance in terms of mobility and being able to be out in the city. And especially, I remember in the focus group, one of the women making the point that, if I'm in town and I'm doing something or I'm with my friends, I can go to a chiwaya and I can get chips and chicken. It's cheap. And the alternative would be to go to the market and buy some maize flour or some potatoes and go home and spend an hour cooking, and then have my siblings expecting some and my parents expecting some. So from her perspective, this was convenient, but it was also a way of satisfying her needs and being able to be out and participating in the public spaces more fully. There's also as much as they're appreciated, there's also a countervailing narrative around the danger associated with them. There's a lot of public concern around what kind of oil or what kind of material is being used in place of oil. And obviously the hygiene around meat being left out and that sort of thing, and scares around food poisoning. This is another story in Blantyre. A woman named Miriam documented this lodge, which is in a place that used to be a sugarcane field where she would go as a child or as a younger person, and socialize and eat sugarcane and play with her friends. And she told the story of how ever since this lodge was built, there's a wall around it, there's a gate. So that public place that used to be so resonant with her social life and was related to snacking and eating food and eating the sugarcane is no longer accessible. And it's sort of emblematic of this consequence of urban growth. And even in this case, prosperity. It's a nice looking place. And there's a lot of these new investments going up in Malawian cities and taking up land and building these walls that didn't exist before, and shifting the social places where people can eat and socialize. And so she made the note that now, young people are more likely to be socializing in their houses or their friends' houses or other private spaces because of this enclosure that's taking place with development. Another story and a general theme was around linkages with rural areas, which was more prominent in Mzuzu, I think partly because of the geography, just being a smaller city. It was physically easier to get to peri-urban and rural areas. So this one guy, Jeffrey, took me to his farm in Lusangazi outside of Mzuzu, about 15-20 minute drive. Here he has a fish pond, which is one of the trends now, or at the time it was a trend, as a way to earn income through aquaculture and to build these fish ponds and stock them and grow the fish and then sell them in the city. So he was heavily engaged in food production, as well as being an urban guy who was living in the city. And they had pigs and they had vegetables and they had maize and they had fruit trees. So there was a lot of productivity going on in that farm, and he was also very connected to it and proud of it. Here's a guy in Blantyre, took this picture, offered this picture of himself in front of the KFC. So another story that emerged was really centered around chicken. There was a lot of discussion about chicken and meat. In Blantyre, there's a KFC, and it was very popular, and it was frequently discussed as something desirable and aspirational and urban, and people wanted to eat it when they had the chance, when we were buying meals as a group. But then in Mzuzu, there was a different conversation that had to do with, it really emerged from the food sovereignty discussion about local chickens and how people would rather have the chickens that are local breeds that are grown, that are just raised in a backyard or on a small farm, because they're cleaner, they're more hygienic, they're fresher, they taste better. There were lots of reasons why people preferred them, but they were also about 6 times more expensive than the kind of chicken that you could buy at a grocery store, as in this picture on the right, which, I've observed this, especially a lot of local shops, the power will go out and then the freezer will thaw and the chicken will kind of thaw a bit, and then there's a lot of questions around the safety of it, as well as the flavor, and people are concerned about hormones and all kinds of chemicals. So there's these kind of complex issues around food and aspirations for food and choice that center around chicken. So anyway, wrapping up some of the emerging themes, and we can discuss how these connect in the question and answer period. So urban change, there's this densification and sprawl, and I mean, especially Lilongwe, it's growing so fast, and you can hardly even get across the city now because the traffic congestion is so extreme. So that changes people's options in terms of being able to easily go to a rural farm or easily find land to cultivate. And also cutting off access to these significant places that have been part of people's strategies, whether it's a guava tree was another story, and then a house was built there, and so now there's no access to that tree, that sort of thing. Social change, we have the changing availability of different types of foods, convenience foods versus traditional foods, which the literature kind of tends to portray a general preference towards the KFC and the white rice and those sorts of things that are considered to be more modern and urban. But it wasn't that simple in our focus group discussions. There was still a lot of concern for traditional foods and the quality of the food and the cleanliness of the food and that sort of thing. And then how that's, you know, embroiled with issues of reproductive and productive roles shifting in the urban context. And then finally, just touching on the political change, you know, it's so inspiring to hear, especially Mary's presentation around policy, and then Chimamwe's presentation around how to do interventions and how to work with empowerment through skills development and that sort of thing, in terms of how that can influence policy. But I really wanted to just focus on what the youth were saying within these conversations and given these tools to express their everyday life. But there was a general concern around the right to access safe and nutritious food and things that they prefer. And then also, yeah, this general issue around how to give voice and how to present this point of view in a more, to a broader audience. So this is our team in Mzuzu in 2019, and some important acknowledgements for the different institutions and the funders and the community-based organizations and all the people who helped make this possible. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Liam, for putting some context there in the Malawian context and sharing a little bit about the youth voices that were amplified through your project. So now we'll turn to Sierra to see what she has to say. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Very good to be here. Thank you for inviting me to speak. One of the advantages to going last is that you have some context for some of the related concepts that I'll be discussing today. So can you all see the non-presenter screen?
We see the presenter screen, I believe.
All right, let's I'm just gonna unplug my second screen. All right, how's that better?
Yes, thank you.
So for this presentation, we're going to move to West Africa and discuss more on the food production aspect of things in rural areas, but it's all related to the work that we've heard from the others today. So I'll be discussing a little bit about development policy and practice and governance, as well as some of the interventions. And I'm really inspired by Liam's work on foodscapes, a lot of related concepts as well, and from young people's perspectives themselves, prioritizing it from their angle. So this study that I'm presenting is part of a much wider study. This is really just one manuscript, and it's an ongoing research study. But what I will focus on discussing broadly is sort of the African young people in African agriculture, literature, and policy from a sort of regional perspective, and then dive into the context of Northern Ghana. The methodology for this study is largely qualitative, and then get into some of the findings and results related to some of the concepts that we've heard about today on intergenerational relations, of what I'm calling here sort of social reciprocity, and then also the sort of intersecting or intersectional disparities and diversities amongst young people in this study. Young people in rural areas are quite diverse. And I find in my study, particularly the concepts of place and gender, those identities and places have a major finding, which I'll discuss. And then I'm going to sort of raise or demonstrate how young people's aspirations differ from maybe the interventions and policy framings. So broadly, very broadly speaking, I wanted to illustrate a quote here of how global policy narratives see the issue of agriculture related to youth. And I think this quote demonstrates it very well. Young people do not perceive agriculture as a remunerative or prestigious profession. And until they find meaningful economic opportunities and attractive environments in rural areas, they will continue to migrate to cities. So investing in young people living in rural areas is the key to enhancing agricultural productivity, boosting rural economies, and ensuring food security. So some of the lessons to glean from that quote is that the problem in this policy narrative is that young people do not perceive food production or agriculture as a sort of prestigious or income generating or business oriented activity, and that the solution, the intervention, is to build their awareness and their skill set to do so. And very much there's a focus on the entrepreneurship and business of farming, or what's sometimes referred to as agropreneurship. And this is really seen as the panacea or sort of catch-all for solving so many different problems, from balancing the demographics in rural areas. So rural areas are seen as aging spaces. Farming is an older person's thing to do, and also sort of rural development. So getting youth engaged in agriculture will solve those issues, as well as food security, growth in the agriculture sector and the economy more broadly. It also prevent young people and people from other people from leaving rural areas to cities, slowing down growth, balancing out service provisions, and all sorts of things. So this focus on developing food production as a business or entrepreneurship is really the idea. And conceptually here, you can see this image where there's this push-pull factor of young people being pushed out of rural areas where there's drought, poor harvest, poor housing, it's quite remote, being pulled to urban centers because there's more opportunities for jobs, education, it's perceived as more modern, whatever that means, whatever you think it means. But broadly speaking, young people in rural areas are seen as sort of a more uniform group or place. And the discussion of the problem is focused on youth out of rural areas and their movements, whether it's for long-term or short-term purposes. And so this study kind of adds to the complexity of this and then relates it to the policy. So the goal of this study is to theorize different young people's aspirations, their movements, their opportunities and constraints to engaging in farming compared with policy and practice, and the wider literature focused on business and entrepreneurship. And so like Liam's study, it's privileging the positions or the perspectives, the voices of young people, and then building from there about interventions, policies, theories. So I conduct the study in northern Ghana. It's part of a much wider study, and a study that I've been conducting over the past decade on many things. And Ghana is a really interesting place to study these issues because, like much of the African continent, the majority of the GDP and the food supply comes from local production. Also, youth unemployment rate is twice as high as general unemployment rate. And young people are the highest proportion of people migrating out. So understanding the reasons for their migrating and the kinds of problems we see in the wider global narratives are important to understand. And as a result of these statistics, the government of Ghana has catered to youth-oriented policy and interventions in many different ways. It started off with a youth and entrepreneurship policy and a sort of skills training and job training and national service oriented opportunities for young people, which was criticized in the past decade for excluding rural youth. And so now there's a big focus on youth and agricultural investment and a number of projects that have been oriented or targeting youth. This map here is a map of Ghana. You can see the pathways of people's migrant routes outside of the country, but also within the country. And so you see people moving between the cities back and forth. So the study that the place I'll be discussing is in the north of Ghana, particularly near the largest city in the north called Tamale. And this is where it's a sort of agricultural hub. There's a lot of focus on agricultural development, and as led by less so by business actors, more by development or official donor assistance, versus other places in the middle and southern belts, which may have more commercial actors and investments. So in this particular place, the focus on agricultural development is part of a wider African Green Revolution model, which is a technical and managerial or business-oriented approach to developing production. I won't get into the details of this, but it's really about getting farmers to produce more, either from the land through the use of technologies like fertilizer or higher yielding seed varieties, as well as farming on larger land plots. And then as part of this, the idea is to commercialize the sector. So the Green Revolution approach in this context at this point in time, meaning it differs from the past in that it's much more private sector oriented. The role of the state is smaller, and that is seen as more sustainable. So some of the major donors that are funding this are the classic actors that we see across the continent, like USAID, AGRA from Gates, the New Alliance, and other larger private sector actors. And they're really focused on what they call incentivizing or value addition, which is really just subsidizing different actors across the agricultural supply chain so that they can add value and then develop this wider market and commercialize. And producers, like young people, are incentivized through developing contract arrangements with these different actors. So with processors, with agri-input dealers, and they're provided credit, whether and payback in kind, and through various means, which I'll talk about. So the research methodology that I pursued here was a 7-month qualitative study, largely in 2 communities located in 1 district in the northern region in 2016, 2017. So on the map here, it was sort of bordering the city of Tamale. So some would say that one community was more peri-urban than the other. And so I was interested in those place-based differences. And it conducted many in-depth interviews with different kinds of smallholders, as well as focus groups, and then interviews with various development actors across that supply chain, as well as NGOs and government workers. So this image here is not a focus group. It's actually a meeting that I was invited to, where the Ministry of Agriculture Extension staff were working with the farmers for the upcoming season. And as part of these interviews, I purposely selected young people as self-identified as young people to get their perspectives compared to how they are from their older generations, as well as some of the political development key actors or key informants. So this is a table of all the results of the engagement and aspirations. I can summarize it in the rest of the presentation, but it's really to give you a sense. So there's not so many young people that were interviewed, only 11, and then 2 focus groups of sort of around 8 people in each focus group, the most of who were men, young men, and they're actually not that young, right? So in this context, young people who self-identified as being a young person were some as old as 35, 36, no one as younger than 25. And this was really interesting to me, and what sort of sparked further analysis in this topic, because it differed dramatically from the literature I was speaking of. And that is they're sort of older, and the limitations to this study is that there really weren't a lot of young people in the communities. Of course, seasonality and timing has a lot to do with this, but generally, when I inquired further about this, people explained it's because young people were moving out. They were moving to the city to pursue education and other opportunities. But the story isn't that simple. And so the engagements that the young people who were interested in talking to me about farming they had different aspirations from what they were engaged in. And I think this is an important distinction that isn't always talked about. So sometimes policies talk about, what young people aspire to do versus what they can do. And theoretically, there's a difference here because there are a web of determinants based on place, based on social indicators and other things that provide different opportunities and constraints for different types of people. And what I disaggregate in this table here is based on place and gender, because that was one of the most striking themes talked about in the interviews and focus groups that kept being raised. And so because of that, I decided to write this study. So just to give you a sense that not every young person who participated in this study was from the rural area or even based in the rural area. So some people were working as teachers or for doing other things, but they actually came from the city and had moved to the rural area and wanted to farm because of their position there. Others were from the rural area, but moved to the city and had come back regularly to farm. And that presented an interesting diversity of perspectives. So generally speaking, most young people had a few acres of different food crops, maybe some animals, with the exception of a few who had 50 to 100 acres or 400 chickens. Those I considered more commercially oriented. And then I'll talk about their aspirations at the end. So when we had these conversations about who is a young person, why do you consider yourself a young person, how does it relate to farming, one of the most striking themes that came up immediately in almost every conversation is that I'm a young person, and what differs from my older generations, I have the energy or I have the physical capability to work on the farm. And that because of that, I have the responsibility to contribute to my family's farm, and that as a result, they take care of me. So this is a social reciprocal relationship that helps to identify who is a farmer in this context and who is not considered a farmer. And that matters because policy in practice often looks at farming as an individual business, an entrepreneurship opportunity, and not something that is based on wider relations, wider identities, and so on. So as Fatima, that's a pseudonym from the focus group, she explained really well this articulation, which is, I don't have anything that can prevent me from doing work that involves using our energy. That's why we're thought to be youth, because it really is our culture that old men or old people should farm. Youth will help them because it's not your responsibility to take care of the whole family. But if you are the old man, it's your responsibility to take care of them, and even you, the youth. So it's about, so that sort of indicated to me that there is an identification of age based on farming, and also about responsibility. So perhaps those who are entitled to more land or more resources or more labor tend to be older, right? Because they have these responsibilities that young people don't. And so providing incentives for people to commercialize or grow in scale has to be considerate of these wider relations and responsibilities. The second major theme of this research is that there were major rural-urban divides in this reciprocal relationship and in the findings. So the young people who I spoke to from the rural areas talked excessively about the constraints to farming, both in terms of climatic and environmental acute changes and limitations, as well as the wider dispossession of land that's happening within the communities. So Salim here explains that the rain pattern too is very erratic. And he pointed to me areas where there's no rain and they have to plow again and start all over again. And so a lot of young people see this, they see it as a waste of time. So they move to go south to Accra where they think there may be money. So it's young people, watching and seeing their families struggle to farm because of climatic changes, but also because of wider land dispossession challenges where people are unable to hold on to or access the land because of wider commercialization efforts, which I'm happy to talk about further. And so rural young people are closely, intimately affected by this. And so even though what might be happening in cities and in other places is sort of unknown, and they see that as perhaps a less risky endeavor because they don't know and are happier to take that risk. And so it's that context that maybe urban youth may not be privy to, or they may not be seeing quite intimately as well. And then also major divides with access to startup capital between those who are from the rural area or those from the urban area. So Matinu explained there are no companies like that or shops like that for them young people to engage themselves. So they have to move to urban places where there's money to get those things. So non-farm livelihoods in this particular situation are seen as more business oriented or remunerative. And also give certain people entitlement or ability to farm to overcome some of the costs with overcoming environmental barriers or some of the green revolution types of technologies that are very expensive. And there were also major differences in participation in contract schemes. So all of the people who participated in the development contract schemes were those from the urban area and not from the rural area, which I'll explain. And then access to land. So you would think that if you're from the rural area, you have greater entitlement to land. But because that you are from that place, and in this context, land is governed at the community level by traditional authorities. What I actually found was that those who were coming to the rural area were from the urban area were farming at much larger scales. And that's because, as Ibrahim explains, our parents don't have the land, and normally they have to beg from our family elders or from the chief. And because of this, we also want to, if we want to farm, they will tell us we don't have the land. So, and then he also went on to say that it's not just about the amount of land available, it's about the quality of the land and the climatic and environmental ecological factors around that often isn't as talked about in rural areas, are seen as this monolithic thing, but actually they're quite uneven in land availability. So he says, but even the land that they use to farm, what will you grow from it? You will not get good yields. And so people are having to farm on larger acreages just to get the same yields because of acutely erratic rainfall, heat stress, floods, droughts associated with climate change. And as a result, it's taking over the land of others. And the last thing I'll talk about are the gender disparities in farming. There are intersecting inequalities here with young women, both shaping young women's aspirations and engagements in farming. So both men and women here explained to me across the study, but particularly in young focus groups, said, you know, as Al-Hassan explained, women are struggling with the housework, and they, meaning family systems, won't even give them a chance to farm. And he says because of the housework, but also because of this construction of farming as being a masculine thing. The man is the overall boss of the house. He has to feed the entire family. No one else has the right or entitlement to do that. So that's why he has access to land. And also there's some, you know, sense of, it seems like toxic masculinity here, where there's the pride. People have so much pride that when a woman is making headway in farming, men perceive her to be dominating over him. And so there are some social as well as economic power relations and constraints to women. And as a result, it shapes their aspirations to farm because it's not perceived as a feminine thing. And also there are all these constraints. And resolving land inheritance, patrilineal land inheritance, which is exclusionary of women, isn't necessarily the answer either. Neither is legal entitlement. You have to resolve some of the social norms around this. Zuera, who was a young woman from the city, explained to me that even if I inherited land, because we're socialized or from a male-dominated society, I have to let my brother or someone else use it. because we've been oriented around that. And this is representative in the wider context where women have far fewer acres than male household heads. Of course, this is related to social norms, but also to roles and responsibilities that are gendered. Men, household heads in particular, responsible for feeding the family, so they're entitled to more land. And what women make tend to be for their own needs. More, not entirely, but more so. And as a result, you see these norms and realities representative in the government and other donor farming contract arrangements that provide credit or other services to farmers, with twice as many, if not more, men participating than women. And this figure here even included the contract arrangements that targeted women directly. So if there weren't NGOs exclusively targeting women, this number would likely be even lower. And the last thing I'll talk about is how all of these different youth aspirations, the very nature of their positionalities, differ from the contract arrangements or interventions being promoted. Or it's not that it's just different, it's more complex. And so because all of these funders are largely funding interventions or contract arrangements that are fairly narrow or uniform, or they're really all doing the same thing, setting them up with high yielding varieties of maize, rice, and soy seed, giving them fertilizer, other agrochemicals, paying for tractor services, and then linking them to a processor. Really, this is very, very uniform pretty much across all the funders. Young people have very different interests based on their positions, and they don't necessarily want to do these things. And so it's both a combination of them not wanting to engage and then also not really having alternative choices. And so young people explained to me, as you can maybe, if you read in the earlier table, is that they want to have more control over their food quality and the costs of their food. And they're very interested in farming for their own consumption as well as for markets, whereas most of the contract arrangements are oriented towards markets. They want to be able to farm all year round, which is not supported by contract arrangements. They want to farm a diverse number of ingredients for their kitchens, a diverse number of foods. They want to integrate animals. They want to integrate trees. They want to use more sustainable ecological intensification practices that are not promoted at all. And this is all with the intention of trying to be more sustainable for their environment as well. So just to conclude, young people's aspirations is influence much more than just whether farming is remunerative. It's also tied to their relationship with their families intergenerationally, as well as the context of acutely erratic rainfall, aridity, rising costs of farming, land shortage, and other things. Their ambitions are quite diverse. Just even within this small sample, it was quite obvious. And I think I would be tempted to say, if you did a wider study, it would highlight this complexity even further, and that there are intersectional unevenness or disparities around this based on gender, generation, and place, urban, rural in particular. To ask yourself, who has the right to farm and why in policy and practice, sort of providing a monolithic way of doing this. So thank you very much. I look forward to chatting. Please email me for further discussion. Visit my website, and thank you to everyone involved in the study and the wider.
Thank you so much, Sierra, and thank you to all the presenters. We will open it up now for questions. If you would like to just turn your video on and unmute, just because we have a small group, or if you prefer to put a question in the chat, you're welcome to ask the panelists some questions. We'll just do a few minutes here as we're running a little bit over time, but there was such a wealth of knowledge to be shared, so thank you all. Yep, just feel free to unmute yourself if you want to ask a question.
Maybe I'll just address the first question or comment from Gertrude around how the chicken debate. And I think this is so Gertrude here says, road chickens taste better. And although, she laughs in this comment, I think it's sort of representative of some of the wider debates happening around food sovereignty, around quality, around safety versus a more globally oriented agricultural supply chain that isn't often talked about. And, the globalization of food, how does this relate to food safety? How does this relate to control and quality and taste and culture? And so maybe we can start there if no one else has any other questions.
Okay, I wanted to just make a comment, two comments. Yeah, it's so interesting, the 3 presentations documenting youth experience, youth aspirations, youth perspectives, youth engagement, participation, that in fact, is the kind of research that can provide the input, the information, that should be taken really to the places and the rooms where policy is discussed, designed, mapped out, for action. The second comment I want to make is it's sort of, it came up in, again, also in all 3, but perhaps more prominently in Sierra and Liam's presentation. No, I think in all 3, in all 3 presentations, but the way it made me think about reformulating the concept of farming and youth engagement. For example, in the South African food policy, as I mentioned in my presentation, there is the strategic action about youth employment in the local agricultural value chain. The policy, of course, is not the place to go into detail with the actual specifics, but based on the literature and even recommendations, it's to get used to grow food. And from Sierra's research, yes, there is certainly a percentage of young people who are interested, who are willing, able to, and who want to grow food, and who, I guess the main question, one of the questions for me that always comes up for me is, if so many of the young people in South Africa are urbanized, how do we present involvement in the agricultural value chain or in the agricultural sector as an opportunity for employment, as an opportunity for as a livelihood opportunity, So that's sort of one thing that came up for me, and just rethinking the moving out of the narrow recommendation of let youth go and farm and produce food, whether it's on small and specifically in the South African context, the support of smallholder farmers who identify as youth. But as you were talking, Sierra, and also with Chimwemwe's presentation, it's more than an individual activity. And I can definitely, when I listened to your presentations and I looked at that, looked at the South African food policy with that information, this is why I think it's also about reconceptualizing the idea of youth and farming and smallholder farming. Now, I may say this, and there are probably people who are already thinking about this or have written about this, because this is not my main area, the urban agriculture, youth involvement in the urban sector, in the rural youth and youth involvement in farming, but coming at it from an urban food and a food systems governance perspective, I can clearly see gaps in the policy around these kinds of the framing issues.
Thank you, Mary, for your comments. They're very well thought out, and you seem to be able to pull all of the presentations together and relate it to your presentation in terms of policy. So we'll just do one last question just because of timing. I wish we could talk more, but our time is running out. But Emmanuel asks, he is interested to know, sorry, just one second. Interested to know if the youth aspire to continue with what they are doing, or is it just a matter of survival to them? And that was directed at Chimwemwe.
You're on mute.
Yeah, thank you very much, Emmanuel, for the question. Yeah, because after the design of the project, because we were still in the phase, we are still doing it, but now we're going to see end of this year if still more will be some results based on the evaluation from the community themselves. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, great. So I guess this will conclude our webinar now, unless there are any other comments to make. I wanted to thank all of our panelists, so Sierra, Liam, Mary, Chimwemwe, and thank our events manager, Camille. And we look forward to staying in contact and seeing how we can maybe collaborate in the future.
Great, thanks so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your time. Take care.
Yeah. Bye-bye.